never sleeps, pal.
Hey there, this is Pete Townsend from Tusk Ventures, and this is episode 27 of Money Never Sleeps, a podcast that looks inside the head of entrepreneurs and at what makes them do what they do. Money Never Sleeps is kindly sponsored by Top Tier Recruitment, a Dublin-based specialist recruitment consultancy in fintech and financial services. In this episode, which is our first one recorded with a guest who is not sitting next to us, woohoo! We talked to Bradley Tusk, CEO and founder of Tusk Ventures, the first venture capital fund dedicated to working with and investing in startups in regulated industries. Bradley's book, The Fixer, which is a rollicking ride through a political savant's adventures at the chaotic intersection of tech and politics, was one of my co-host Owen's more recent reads. So Owen did what you do when you like a book. You reach out to the author to try to get him on your podcast and find out what makes him do what he does. So let's get on with it. Here we go again. Welcome to the 27th episode of Money Never Sleeps. We're here in the shiny new offices of our kind sponsor, Top Tier Recruitment in Dublin Landings. That's WeWork Dublin Landings, one of their new franchises here. I'm Pete Townsend.
And I'm Owen Fitzgerald.
And we're on remotely for the first time on Money Never Sleeps with Bradley Tusk from Tusk Ventures. Welcome to the show, Bradley.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Great to have you on. Like Owen was saying before we got on, he's read your book. And I've listened to 3 different podcasts with you telling your story, so we kind of get it.
Yeah,
right? But
I'm sorry you have to go through all that.
No, that's fine. It's hopefully we can take a little bit of a different approach to get you talking about a few more things over the next half hour or so. But just for our listeners, maybe just tell us the backstory of how you got to this point in your life. And so, just get people caught up.
Sure. Yeah, totally. So I came to venture into tech through a weird way, which is through politics, which is not normally how people do that. I had done things like I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager when he was mayor of New York. I had been the deputy governor of Illinois. I had been Chuck Schumer's communications director in the U.S. Senate, and fell into tech kind of accidentally. In 2011, I was sitting in a meeting, and a friend of mine called and said, hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him? I become Uber's first political strategist that day. I get really lucky when Travis calls me back and says, I can't afford your fee. Would you take equity? Thank God I said yes. That was during the Series A. And then I spent the next 5 years mainly just kicking the shit out of the taxi industry across the U.S. to make ride sharing legal in ultimately 384 different jurisdictions. And, was enjoying working with Uber, and obviously, the value of the equity kept going up and up, and thought, I should do this with more startups. But I really struggled at first to convince other startups to take politics seriously. So I would go to the Valley and I'd meet with some founder. I'd say, hey, in this sector, here's who you're disrupting. Here's their political power. Here's what they're going to do to stop you. And I'm happy to help you with it. And I'll do it in return for equity. Not even really knowing what I meant by saying equity, just knowing that whatever I did with Uber seemed to be working. And the typical response I would get is, no, you don't understand. I went to Stanford. I was in Y Combinator. John Doerr is on my board. And when those stupid regulators see how brilliant I am, they're going to do whatever I want. And I would kind of laugh and say politics doesn't quite work like that. But it took Uber and Airbnb and the others having these really big fights to get to a point where the Valley and startups in general started taking politics seriously enough that a fund like mine that invests in startups in regulated industries and works with those startups to solve their political problems could even exist.
And it's an entirely different beast, politics. I think that's what people don't get. So I touch on it, I suppose, in some ways through the work I do. I work for the government on the Irish government's investment arm. But I understand the political issue from the inside. And I think it's probably what you found is by having that insight, people don't get that unless they've actually been through it. And you've probably been through that from your campaign work and through your work in the state of Illinois.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you there now.
Okay, I have you back. Okay, I lost you for a minute, but I have you back now. Great.
So look, I'll repeat the question. I was saying I understand it a bit somewhat. I work for the Irish government on their investment arm, but I get the political space a bit from our regular dealings that we would have with government agencies. I think people don't get it unless they've been through the process or seen it from the inside out. They don't understand that it can be an entirely challenging and not even logical sort of space to work in and operate in.
Totally. So, I think the thing that people in tech struggle the most to understand about politics is the things that they care about in politics are not the things you care about in tech. right? So in tech, your goal is ultimately, did I come up with an interesting idea? Can I build a team? Can I raise money? Can I acquire customers? Can I disrupt an industry? And then can I have a successful exit, right? If you're in politics, your goal is effectively, can I get attention? Can I raise money? Can I make my poll numbers go up? The things you care about are radically different than what a founder in tech cares about. I think the biggest mistake people in tech make is they just assume that what makes sense to them makes sense to everybody else, right? And ultimately, if you want a politician to do what you want them to do, they need to be convinced either that by going along with you, their chances of re-election are going to be higher, or by not going along with you, their chances of re-election will be lower. That's fundamentally it. Every politician I know, with the exception of Mike Bloomberg, is solely motivated by re-election. They can't live without the attention and validation that comes with holding office. And that's how all of their decisions are made. And so it doesn't matter if you're really smart or your platform creates jobs or gives consumers more choices, whatever else. Politicians don't give a shit. All they care about is, can this help me or hurt me electorally? And if you can't frame your issue in that way, you're not going to win.
And that's it. I think you pointed to it there. It's around framing the issue, because the challenge, I suppose, and I know from the book, and I'll mention it again, The Fixer, I read it back to back, I suppose, in the space of 2 days maybe, because I was fascinated by it. But it's the approach to take to your campaign. It's, are you going for the kind of beg for forgiveness or ask for permission piece? And I'd imagine that's a challenge depending on the company then you're working with.
Totally. And the reality is it varies from company to company and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? So with Uber, obviously, we're known for having chosen the beg for forgiveness route, but we didn't have a choice, right? Because in every single market, the taxi industry had a ton of money, a ton of lobbyists, a ton of political connections, and the only way to fight that was with our own customers. And the only way to do that was to build market share in the first place, which meant we had to launch. But if you take, for example, Bird, which is a scooter startup that we've been investing in and working on, there are jurisdictions in the US and around the world where we feel like the law is perfectly fine as is, so there's no reason we can't launch. And there are other jurisdictions where it's pretty clear to us that the law needs to be changed. And in those cases, we're going through the legislative process to change it. So you need different calculations to understand both what you can do, what you can't do, what the risks are, what the odds of success are. You have to be able to understand that for every jurisdiction around the US or all around the world, and think about it intelligently and apply it properly in each place.
And obviously there are some that then will just choose, like the Tesla example you mentioned in the book, that they'll just choose not to have that as their reputation. Because, Uber was a fighting kind of the public bodies from the start, but Tesla chose a different route.
Travis loves to fight. It's funny, Elon, in my experience with him, is very, obviously everyone knows he's a very smart guy, but I found him to be very reasonable and normal as well. But the issue there was, Tesla wants to sell cars directly to consumers without going through car dealerships. Car dealerships might have made sense in the 1950s, but they're a total anachronism right now, and they just impose more cost on the buyer. But car dealers, at least in the US, are pretty politically powerful. They're the ones who sponsor the Little League team and the 4th of July parade, and they give money to every politician. So defeating them is not easy. You need to pass laws state by state. And typically the only way to do that was to show that the relationship that they had with local politicians was corrupt enough to get everyone to back off. And that required being pretty tough politically. It required things like opposition research, including accusing people of corruption, push polling, tactics that are legal, but they're rough. And Tesla's concern was that if they employed those tactics, even if it helped them win these specific legislative fights, it would hurt their reputation overall, and it wouldn't be worth it. And I think Tesla managed to do some damage to their reputation anyway in the last year or so. But so they didn't do it. And, look, I think it was the wrong choice. And I think part of the problem there was you had people on the team who didn't seem to have the confidence to tell Elon that they disagreed with him. So kind of, he would make decisions based on very little information, which is all he can do, given how busy he is. And he expects people to then say to him, well, here's what you're not considering. And I think these people were all kind of afraid to do that. So they didn't win these fights. And that's just a choice you have to make. If you want to win a big political fight, you can succeed usually, but it comes with a cost of time and money and effort and reputation. You've got to understand that.
And do you think, turning it to you, I suppose, more personally, do you think that the route you've gone down was a natural progression, or was it a point, having done the work with Uber, that you thought, I have something here to pursue? Yeah,
a little more the latter. So on one hand, where it's natural is working in a political campaign and working at a startup in some ways are kind of similar, right? There's a lot of energy at both, a lot of momentum. There's some set of ideals. You're working around a specific concept or candidate. You're working towards an exit of some kind, whether it's election day or an IPO or an acquisition or whatever it is. So in some ways, they fit together pretty nicely. On the other hand, it took a very weird combination of things for me to be in a position to create this kind of new market between tech and politics. So having worked around the U.S. in different forms of government, legislature, executive branch, state, federal, local campaigns, having had the Uber experience, having had my kind of best political experience be Mike Bloomberg, and he had so much credibility in the tech world, and then also having a pretty high risk tolerance, and B, because I took my fee from Uber and equity, I'm kind of good when it comes to money at this point, which means I can take a lot of risks, right? And I don't have a problem saying, okay, we're going to work with these 15 different startups in return for equity, which means I got to pay my people every 2 weeks regardless. I may see money from these companies. I may not. I may see a 20X. I may see nothing. I have to have the cash to float and take that risk. So it took a combination of a lot of weird circumstances for me to get to this point. But I'm lucky that we worked hard enough and got some good breaks, and it worked out.
Just with a money thing aside, given that that financial freedom, Bradley, is there an element of just helpfulness that runs through your blood that helps you to do this?
I think so. I mean, I certainly like to think so. One of the reasons that I worked in government and politics was because I liked having an impact on public policy and trying to do things that were different and better. And in a lot of ways, the time that I spent in government was not unlike the startup world. And that when I was the deputy governor of Illinois, I had the power and the ability to sort of come up with any idea I wanted and then try to turn it into state policy. And frequently, Illinois being a Midwestern state, they would say, well, who else has done that? I'd say, no one. That's the point, right? They said, no, we want to be like the 12th, right? I always wanted to be the first because to me, that's what, anyone can maintain the status quo, but, do things differently and better that make the state run better, serve the constituents better, serve the taxpayers better. So I think that way it's been fairly similar. I think also if you look at what I've done with my money, I have a family foundation called Tusk Montgomery Philanthropies in which we do two things. We fund hunger programs around the U.S. So we fund and run campaigns in different states to create universal school breakfast so that every kid gets access to a healthy breakfast every morning. Thanks to the work we've done so far, 3 million more kids now have access to school breakfast. And the harder one, though, is voting. I'm trying to create a world where everyone can vote in elections on their phone over the blockchain. One state has done it so far, West Virginia. They offered it to members of deployed military, both in the primary in May and again now in the election, which is tomorrow, depending on the time we're recording this at least. And we paid for all the costs for the state to administer the election. We brought together the technology providers and the government. So far, so good. The primary went off without a hitch. And my hope is that if we live in a world where, participation goes, say, in a primary from 12% to 70%, I have to imagine if you're sitting in Ireland, you say, what's wrong with the U.S.? Why can't they pass gun control? Why can't they deal with climate change? Why can't they have a sensible immigration policy? And the reason why is almost every election in the U.S. is determined in the primaries because the districts are drawn in a way, it's called gerrymandering. That means that whoever wins the primary is going to win the general election. So as a result, it comes down to the primary, and turnout in primaries is abysmally low. So, this year in the U.S., in the most political of all political years because of Trump, turnout was still under 20%, which means 4 out of every 5 voters didn't bother to actually vote. In the primaries, those who do vote tend to be the most right-wing or the most left-wing. So if you're running for office and you want to stay in office, you want to make those people happy who actually show up to vote in your primary. So if that means you're a Republican congressman from Florida and turnout in your primary is 12%, and half of those voters are NRA members, even if you know logically that an assault weapons ban makes total sense, you're not going to vote for it because you're not going to alienate half the voters in your primary. If turnout became 60%, because now everyone can vote in the election on their phone, then all of a sudden the NRA's vote share would shift from 50% to 10%, and you would be crazy politically not to vote for an assault weapons ban. So if you assume that politicians will always do what is logically in their political best interest and nothing else, you've got to change the inputs or you won't change the output. So I am spending a huge amount of my time and resources to try to create this, running all over the country. In fact, we're starting a little bit on the UK side. President of my foundation is going to be at Oxford next week talking about this. And so, I mean, my view is, I try to be helpful in government. I try to be helpful through my foundation. And I like to invest in startups where I think that, the net outcome is societally positive, right? So, for example, there's a startup called Handy run by an Irishman named Oisin Hanrahan, if you know him.
I actually went to, sorry to cut across you, I went to school with Oisin. So I knew him quite well back in the day. He was an entrepreneur back then, even.
Totally. He's a brilliant guy. And one of the things, he has a platform called Handy that connects basically people who clean homes, people who want a housekeeper. And he has this idea that he wants to be able to give them benefits, healthcare, pension, workers' comp, disability. But the Handy model, like Uber and every other startup, requires people being independent contractors, not employees of the company. And they have the flexibility to take whatever job they want, work whenever they want, everything else. So Sheen said, can't we still give them benefits? And the lawyers all said no, because if you do that, you will be declared to be a full-time employer, and that destroys your business model. So Sheen, to his great credit, has been running campaigns with us all over the U.S. to have the right to do this. We won in Arizona, and it's starting to be created right now. And it's someone who's able to both give people much more economic opportunity. Let's say that you're a student and you want to work 14 hours a week and make some extra money. Now you can, and still ensure that you have things like healthcare. So we love working with startups where we think there's really a societal benefit to the work that they're doing.
What's your criteria like, or not even criteria, but when you're talking to an entrepreneur and deciding whether or not to suggest that you work together, what are some of the things that you look for?
Yeah, so I'd say I'm going to split this up into two parts: when we invest and when we just take equity for our work. So when we invest, a lot of it is like the typical VC, because look, we have our investment fund is outside money and 2 and 20 model, and so we have to be as responsible as we can with our LP's money. So we look at the total addressable market, the opportunity, the idea, the underlying tech, the founder, their ability, the management team, all of those things. And then the other thing that we add to the process is there some sort of political obstacle that if that were solved, this company could grow exponentially, right? Can we give Bird the ability to operate scooters, in every single market? Can Lemonade sell insurance? Can FanDuel conduct sports betting? Whatever it is. And if we believe that everything else is great and there's just one underlying political problem that we think we can solve, then we try to invest money on the front end, go solve the problem, and we see the value of our investment shoot way up. When we're looking at a company just in terms of taking equity, but not actually deploying capital, which means in those cases I'm the LP, we'll loosen the screen a little bit, because sometimes I just want us to learn about something. So we've worked on desalination projects, or we're working right now with the government of the Marshall Islands to create the first ever sovereign cryptocurrency, because I think they're interesting, or I think we'll just learn a lot from them. So sometimes we'll take on things purely as a learning experience, or we just think, hey, this is going to do some real good in the world. Let's try to push this thing forward. And then in other cases with a fund, it's more traditional.
And is there a certain trigger for believability or credibility of a founder that's at a very early stage, or do you even touch early stage?
Yeah, we tend to invest in seed and A, so we are early stage, because our hope is to make it, try to make a 10x on every investment and to have a fund that ultimately produces a 3.5x return. And so, yeah, we tend to say typically seed and A, and the founder is really important. A lot of times it's believing in their ability to execute something because they won't have actually executed it yet. But you can look at, what companies they were involved in before, what other investors are in the deal. And for me also, the way that they look at politics is very instructive, because the founder who says, I don't care about that stuff, I'll just deal with it when I have to, it never works out well, right? Because then you wait till something becomes a crisis and it's 10 times harder to fix. And if that's your mentality, I don't really want your equity in the first place. Whereas if you say, listen, I understand that I don't know this world, but I also know that if we succeed in real estate, gambling, energy, insurance, whatever it is, we're going to piss off a lot of powerful people. We're going to take away a lot of market share. I want to get out ahead of those problems. Then I say, okay, these people are pretty thoughtful. They're thinking ahead. And if they can understand my world that way, odds are this is how they think more generally. So that's what I look for.
I gotcha. And there's a few things in there as well, right? You talk about what have they done before? What businesses have they executed in the past? One of the ones that just came up in the last couple of weeks that I find interesting is Spring Labs. Adam, and you know the guy's last name from Spring Labs. He was partner with Brian Norton from Future Finance. Yes, exactly. So he moved on after Future Finance, which was an educational finance platform here in Ireland, Bradley. And Adam started up a business called Avant. And Avant's first funding partners on the VC side happened to lead the round for them for what is basically a $15 million seed round, which is pretty high for a seed round, right? Or is either seed or Series A. One of those tweener rounds, right? And just seeing that those relationships exist across the board in terms of you have a founder with a pre-existing funding relationship from the last venture that they launched, and those things continue. Those things just carry forward. Do you see businesses moving from a perspective of, all right, well, they've launched one business that has an element to it where you guys can really help, to have you seen them go a second time? And have you seen that trend carry through to someone looking to try to tackle some of those same types of world problems, or at least those that need the kind of help that you can deliver?
Yeah, absolutely. So, given that our fund is relatively new, there aren't that many founders that we've invested in that have then finished the exit and then gone on to start something else. Although Nigel Eccles, who's Scottish and founded FanDuel, since founded another company that deals with screen sharing that we didn't invest in because it wasn't really within our mandate, and we thought the valuation was a little high, but very, very talented guy. And but yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things is, on this blockchain voting stuff, I've been going to a lot of different blockchain companies and saying, you're doing the hard stuff, right? You're figuring out how to transmit, mine Bitcoin, or you're how to transmit health records or things that are really complicated. Transmitting votes is actually relatively simple. Can I convince you to expand into that area? Because I need a more robust ecosystem of blockchain developers working on this. I can create some level of demand among politicians to try out the idea, especially if I'm paying for the cost of the state to administer the election. But there's one developer in Boston that called Votes, VOATZ. They've done a great job, but there's really just one. And I think ultimately to have the kind of competition that we need a dozen different companies working on this, whether it's their primary activity or secondary activity, competing with each other and innovating so that we can make blockchain, voting both really safe and make it really happen.
Yeah, I really like the whole proposition. My parents are over from Boston this weekend, and I was explaining your approach with a blockchain-based voting to them after hearing it on the full ratchet, and talk to them about what you said about the mindset of politicians, and they're both Boston-based Democrats, right? So they kind of they can feel what you're talking about, right? How do you see a timeline for this? I know
Yeah. So West Virginia was our 2018 pilot. My hope is that we'll announce Colorado pretty soon for 2019. I'd like to do 3 or 4 states in 2019. Everyone who's in power right now doesn't want this to happen,
exactly,
right? Because it makes it far easier for them to lose power. So they can't say, I don't want people to vote because that sounds terrible. So they're going to say it's not safe. We can't do it. So I've got to prove that it's safe. So my sense is after I spend the next 3 years or so funding and running pilot programs in different jurisdictions around the U.S. and hopefully around the world too, it just keeps showing time after time after time this thing works. And if there's a diversity of jurisdictions based on geography, based on different types of people participating, so we've deployed military right now, the disabled community is a pretty good candidate to work on this, that eventually, the objections from politicians become more and more hollow because it's clear that this thing does work and we can bring it to the mainstream. My guess is that if I never did anything around this, it would still happen. It just might take, say, 25 years. And I think that if we do our job right, maybe we can make it happen in 10 years.
So tell me, Bradley, you're described by Fast Company as Silicon Valley's political savior. That must create a fair amount of pressure then on you at the same time in terms of being able to deliver this sort of solution to the companies you work with now.
It does. Yeah, I mean, so look, there's 17,000 startups in the U.S. alone. We've invested in 16 out of Fund 1. We've probably taken equity and another 20 on top of that. So it's a pretty small sample size. We try to pick things that we think are that we can win. Not necessarily they're not a long shot and hard, but that at least it's not impossible. And in the book, sometimes I talk about some scenarios where I got that wrong and took on stuff that wasn't winnable, and the lessons that I learned from that. And things that we think have real economic potential. And the idea also is just to drive thinking around these issues. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book in the first place is, since the vast majority of startups can't work with us or can't receive investments from us, I still want them to know how to think about politics the right way, how to go about it the right way. So the more that I'm out there, whether it's the book or on podcasts like this or speaking at conferences or writing columns or everything else, I'm trying to create a whole new market in that intersection of tech and politics. And it takes a lot of money and a lot of work and a lot of campaigns, but also just a lot of evangelizing. And that's what I'm doing right now.
Great. Well, listen, obviously, like I said, I read the book. There's a huge amount of useful information in it. And I'm sure we could talk for hours about all the things you can do. And again, like I said, it'll be great eventually when you can get over this part of the world and we can get you in front of some of the people that we work with. What is one thing that people wouldn't expect to know about you directly?
That's a great question. I'm the founder, and for a long time I was an active participant in something called Operation Sandwich, which sounds like it has some sort of noble purpose. It doesn't. Every year, a group of guys and I would pick a city, we'd make a list of 10 sandwiches, and we'd eat them all in one day. There was no good cause for it. It was totally hedonistic, but it was a lot of fun. Now that I'm 45, my metabolism has slowed down to a point where I can't really pull that off anymore. But I think we did it from like 2002 to maybe 2013 or 14. So it was a lot of fun, and maybe someone will listen to this and they'll grab the mantle and keep the tradition going.
I'm looking at Pete here, and it sounds like he's going to take the mantle.
Yeah. I was going to say,
cool.
What's your favorite sandwich, Bradley?
Oh God, it's almost based on the city, right? So we tried to figure out like each city which would win, right? So New York, the classics like a pastrami sandwich or a bagel and lox would do really well. In Chicago, it would usually be an Italian beef sandwich. So it varied. In Miami, it was a Cuban sandwich. In Philly, it was a hoagie. We never did Boston, but I suspect the lobster roll would probably do pretty well there. So it varies from kind of like how the politics for startups vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, sort of the best sandwiches. We did a lot of barbecue in Austin and Central Texas. So we've probably consumed at this point, over the 13, 14 years we did it, however long, probably like 100,000 calories for sandwiches. So, I've got the stomach to show it.
Nice. Yeah, that's. I hold my sandwiches pretty religiously. The care that I put into making them now that I've got kids as well, and we're going on a day trip to the beach, packing those up and wrapping them perfectly in tinfoil. That I take a lot of pleasure out of that. That's kind of some of my OCD coming out as well.
Yeah, I have that too. Hey, look, if you end up doing it seriously, hit me up and I'll give you at least all the tips and things that I learned over the years.
Awesome. Yeah,
you can do it right.
I think there's another book in there.
Yeah, there is.
There we go.
Bradley,
cool.
Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, and I appreciate it's early in the morning over there for you, but thank you so much for coming on the show, and shout out to the work you're doing, and also to the book, The Fixer, for anyone who's listening. A fantastic book, really interesting approach to dealing with politics as a startup.
Thanks, Bradley.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me, and look forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Money never sleeps, pal.
So that wraps things up for this episode, but don't go just yet. We'd like to thank Bradley for opening up his mind for the 27th episode of Money Never Sleeps, a podcast brought to you by Norio Ventures and Owen Fitzgerald, and sponsored by Top Tier Recruitment. You can find out more about Bradley by following him on Twitter at Bradley Tusk, or on tuskventures.com, or on his personal website, bradleytusk.com, or just pick up his book, The Fixer. Dig in and let us know what you think. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to Money Never Sleeps on transistor.fm, iTunes, Spotify, or on your favorite online media channel, and leave us a review. Each one helps. You can now access all of the Money Never Sleeps episodes through a link on the podcast page on the Norio Ventures website, which is norioventures.com. If you're an entrepreneur with a story to tell anywhere in the world, drop us a line using the contact form on the Norio Ventures website. Besides this podcast, we help founders build their ventures. So check out norioventures.com to learn more and get in touch. Finally, we'd like to thank Conan Brophy from Create Sound for recording and editing this podcast. And thanks to Top Tier Recruitment for hosting us at WeWork's new location at Dublin Landings. Till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!